Great, so welcome to week 2 of Post-Growth Entrepreneurship. I'm just going to start very quickly with a really short recap of where we stopped last time, because we'll be continuing with that same line of thought. Also, just to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're going to be doing today. So basically, the first half of this class is really just evaluating, as I said, sort of the status quo. I figure sort of either at the end of today or at the beginning of next week, we'll really be starting with the sort of what is post-growth entrepreneurship, how do you actually build the businesses, how do you do it differently. But I just want to sort of cover today a little bit more about the startup ecosystem, business education, and then also social enterprise. So, all right. So this is where we had left off last time, and we were basically talking about how IPOs, in a way, are a kind of pump and dump scheme. So again, you have startups that basically are hyper growth. They are losing cash at a very fast rate. And if they are cash losing before the IPO, they're probably still cash losing after the IPO. And in a sense, it's actually a very strange system that we have. So I guess really the question here is, you have companies like WeWork, and many others that are funded by SoftBank and these really large VC dumps of money. And the question is, when you have the WeWorks that are spending money 5 times faster than they're getting it from their customers, the question we don't ask often enough is actually whose money are these cash-losing unicorns, right, spending? And if you actually follow the money, what you discover is that, particularly in the United States, 65% of the limited partners, so in other words, 65% of the investors in most venture capital funds are pension funds. Okay? So what this means, essentially, is when a lot of these cash-losing, because you know them, all the 15-minute delivery companies, we kind of wonder, like, how can they be losing so much money for so long? But the thing is, the pension funds, why are they investing in these kinds of things, right? And up until recently, the answer for this has been interest rates. So up until reasonably recently, the interest rates have been super low. So they've been, very close to 0%. In some cases, there's even been negative interest, for example, on some of our bank accounts. And that put pension funds into the really hard place that, of course, someday people like you and me want to retire, right? And we're putting our money, and also oftentimes our companies are making matching donations for what we're putting into our retirement funds, and they need to be able to get a return on that investment so someday we can retire with the level that we're expecting, which basically means that at minimum the pension has to keep pace with inflation. Now, the problem here has been that with the very low or zero interest rates, basically the traditionally safe investments that a pension fund would have, things like, bonds, basically these things were completely worthless, if not costing them money. So they were starting to move their money into so-called riskier asset classes like venture capital. Because, of course, the venture capitalists were making promises about returns. Because, of course, then the VCs are saying, yeah, so we're going to get you 10x returns, 20x, whatever. But truthfully speaking, though, 90% of VCs have failed to keep pace with the stock market in the last 25 years. In other words, if you had just bought an index fund and held it, and did absolutely nothing else with that money, you would have done better than basically 90% of VC funds. So what this means then is that, and of course the problem is you can't really tell what the track record of that VC is going to be until after they've had a fund, for about 10 years, when you finally have enough historical data to be able to judge the performance. So this also brings us, another thing also is that with the institutional investors, also because of these zero interest rates, they also have been investing in these shares post-IPO, also because basically they were speculating on this. And of course, as long as we were in a growth economy, and we were in a growth economy until recently because the Fed, of course, was printing a lot of money, and and basically the stock market was going up. It seems like it's a great way to do things until it's not. And of course, now we finally entered a situation where interest rates are up again, and things are not going so great anymore. But and here's the thing. So we hear a lot about unicorns, right? And we're told that when you're starting a startup, be a unicorn, right? And we've got our Prince Constantine, here in the Netherlands, also who's shouting from the rooftops, the Netherlands needs more unicorns. But we don't ask the question often enough, do we? Do we actually need more unicorns? What is a unicorn actually? So a unicorn, of course, the definition of a unicorn is a company that has a $1 billion US valuation or higher. Okay? But here's the thing. Unicorns have a dirty secret. 90% of unicorns are bleeding money. 90%, right? And I'm not just talking new unicorns, but new unicorns, old unicorns, all, pretty much all the unicorns except for 10% of them are bleeding money. So here's the thing. When we're talking then about unicorns, maybe we should actually give them a different name. Because what we're actually doing with unicorns here is we are attempting to do pension-subsidized monopoly forming. That's basically what it is. Because again, this pension money is going into these VC funds. They're trying to subsidize, again, these cash-losing businesses until they can take over a certain share of the market. So when we ask ourselves the question, do we actually need more unicorns in the Netherlands? We're not asking ourselves the question about whether or not those unicorns are actually really improving the local economy of the country that is basically stimulating these very large companies. So the real question here then in all of this is who's winning, right? Because we have the pension funds that are basically losing cash by subsidizing these unicorns. They're also then on the side of post-IPO buying these shares, and of course a lot of those shares are tanking. So basically the pension funds are getting it from both sides. And the other thing also is that it's a well-known statistic that 90% of startups fail, right? So who actually is winning here, right? I mean, the founders seem to not be winning. The institutional investors, the limited partners of the VC funds, seem to not be winning. Who is actually winning here in this system is the fund manager. And there's a reason why. It's because these fund managers tend to operate with a particular fee structure that is called the 2 and 20, okay? So 2% asset under management fee and a 20% what we would call carried interest. So in other words, if a pension fund or other institutional investor like an insurance company or a bank, let's say they give me their money to manage, I take 2% of that, right? That's the management fee. With the carried interest, what this means is that if your company grows like a hockey stick, right? And then you get to the exit in 3 to 5 years, I get 20% of that as the fund manager. So you can see very clearly how this is embedding incentives into the system. Quite simply, you can say that that 20% carried interest is embedding the growth imperative into startups. So if we start asking questions about, well, how can we actually create a post-growth economy, right? An economy where we can just have companies that thrive but don't necessarily grow. Of course, then the obvious answer is, well, can't we do something about the fee structure here, right? Because as long as the VCs are going to receive 20% of that exit, of that value, they are going to continue pushing the startups to exit. This makes sense, right? Another thing also is that 2% is mega extractive, but a lot of people wouldn't think so because 2, of course, is a very small number, right? And you would just think, now if you start thinking about 2% mortgage interest rates, you start getting a little bit of a gut feeling of how 2% adds up over a long enough period of time. Now, the people who don't think that 2% is extractive don't understand how compounding works, right? Because, of course, every year you have compounding fees. So let's say I want to retire. So I put my money into a Roth IRA or a 401k or one of these kinds of retirement vehicles. And let's say that it has a 2% management fee. What most people don't realize is that given the historical performance of the stock market for the last 25 years, with a 2% management fee, I will have given 2/3 of my returns to the investors, to the fund managers. 2/3. So that's incredibly inefficient. But a lot of people just don't spend enough time thinking about this, about how much we're actually paying in fees. Now, John Bogle, who was the founder and CEO of Vanguard, which of course now is one of the largest investment companies in the world, he used to talk a lot about the tyranny of the compounding fees, right? And that was actually part of the reason why John Bogle invented the index fund. In other words, this fund that basically passively tracks the stock market, because what he was attempting to do was to take fees and bring them down effectively to zero. Now, it turns out actually that, of course, when he first introduced this concept of the index fund, they actually had named it Bogle's Folly. Yeah, Bogle's Folly indeed. I mean, now, of course, passive investment that was derived from the index fund is 35% of the total investment market. So, I mean, one can say that John Bogle had the last laugh here. But really, though, I mean, the point that he was trying to make is that, he was trying to create this mutualized mutual fund and essentially create, in a way, almost a kind of not-for-profit investment product. So he was actually a bit ahead of his time with this. The other thing also is that because of this 2 and 20, again, most of the time the VCs actually are not getting that good returns. 90% are not keeping pace with the stock market. However, what's happening here is that us whose money are going into this are bearing the risk. And because the fund managers are getting a flat 2%, regardless actually of how the stocks in the portfolio do, they are going to get that 2% regardless of how it performs. So in other words, the normal people are bearing all the risk, and the fund managers are getting all the benefits. This system is extremely weird, right? I mean, we sort of accept it as the status quo, but when we start talking about the 1%, right? A lot of them happen to be fund managers for precisely this reason. So if we're trying to do something really to systemically change wealth inequality, boring things like fee structures really start to matter. And most people either don't understand how it works or don't care, or they think it's boring. But truthfully speaking, it's precisely because we don't care and because we think it's boring that they can get away with this, right? And of course we see these effects of the wealth inequality in our day-to-day lives, but sometimes we just have trouble sort of putting these things together. So another thing also is that this system also doesn't work out very well all the time for founders. They can get lucky, and I'm not even talking about the 90% failure rate of startups here, but what I'm talking about is term sheets. So if you are a startup founder and if you are trying to get investment from a VC, they are going to give you these term sheets in which they are basically dictating the terms and conditions of receiving that capital. As with many things, the fine print matters. Because there is a particular situation which can happen when, like let's say that you have a startup, right? And then it receives a really large investment round from VCs. Now, it grows really, really quickly, but then at a certain point, something happens. Like either there's a market downturn or just, the founders do something silly, and they wind up having an exit, but it was just a little bit less spectacular of an exit than they were predicting, given the valuation in the last funding round. In this particular situation, what can happen if you're not careful with the terms and conditions in the term sheet is that sometimes the VCs will get everything, and then the founders and the early employees will get nothing. And this is actually because of a concept that's called liquidation preference. So to explain the concept behind liquidation preference, I'll give you a quick sketch of how it works. So let's say that investors put 100,000 euros into a company for 50% of the shares, okay? At that point, the company is sold for 150,000 euros. I mean, if you're just doing a split of 50% shares from the exit, then what would happen is that 75K would go to the founders, and then the other 75K would go to the investors, which basically means then that the founders would earn 75K and the VC would lose 25K from that initial investment. This situation obviously isn't fair for the VC, and that is the reason why the concept of liquidation preference was invented. So investors that are putting that money in the beginning, they receive something called preferred shares. I'm sure you've heard the term before. And what preferred shares mean is that the VCs that with the preference are paid back before everyone else. So let's go back to this same hypothetical scenario where the investors put in 100K and then the company is sold for 50K. The way that it works now is that when the company now sells for 150K euros, basically the investor is paid back first, so at least the VC would recoup their 100K, and then the 50K then that's left over goes to the founders. Now, this seems, I think, pretty reasonable, right? And that's the reason why things are set up this way. However, this isn't where it ends. Ultimately, the VCs are trying to get what's called multiples of the return on their investment, because it's not just that they want to receive their initial investment back, but it's that they want to receive 3 times, 5 times, 7 times the return on their investment for their limited partners. So what happens then is if we go back to our hypothetical example where an investor puts 100K into a company, let's say they have a liquidation preference value of, for example, 3, okay? So what that means is now if, and on top of that, they have 50% of the shares for putting in that 100K. Now what happens here is that because there's a liquidation preference of 3, if the company now were to sell for 500,000, then 300K first goes to the investor. That's again, because they have preference and because they have a multiple of 3. And then, of course, there's that 200K that's left over. And then the question is, what happens with that 200K? Now, there's a second concept with liquidation preference that's called participation. So you have cases where there's participation and no participation. So if there's no participation, then the 300K the multiples is basically all that the VC gets. But most of the times, they want to participate in that extra, amount that's left over. So what happens then is if the VC has 50% of the shares, they're now going to get another 50% on top of that original 300 of the remaining amount, which basically means in this case that the VC gets 400K, whereas the founders get 100K. You all can see the direction this is going in, right? So, all right. So let's consider one more thing. There's a concept called preference stacks. And of course, you're probably familiar with the fact that with venture capital, there are multiple VC rounds. So you're going to have a C round, and a seed round, and an A round, B round, C round, however many rounds you wind up having. And of course, each round is generally much larger than the last one. What happens here is that typically the VC in the most recent investment round has preference above all of the earlier investors from the earlier VC rounds. So in other words, if you have a C round that was considerably larger, then they will basically from the C round they get paid back first, then from the B round they get paid back, then from the A round they get paid back, then from the seed round they get paid back, and then sort of after that then maybe the founders are also included with this. So let's say we have a situation now where you had an A round, which was basically family, friends, and fools, right? Somebody just getting some money from people in their nearby them. And then they got a much larger B round from a venture capitalist. And let's say that the family, friends, and fools round was 100K and the VC round was tens of millions. Now, let's say that with this 10 million, again, you have an exit, but that exit winds up being a little bit smaller than you were hoping for. This is precisely the occasion where liquidation preference will bite you, because what winds up happening is not just that the founders might wind up not getting paid, but the family, friends, and fools from the very first round also might wind up losing their money. So the thing is, when you get a later VC round that is incredibly huge, and you look in the term sheets and there's all kinds of multiples and participation on that, what you're doing is you're putting more and more and more pressure on the size of your exit, and if you can't live up to that in the end, you wind up getting nothing. And we celebrate these really, really large VC rounds, but most people actually don't realize how precarious of a position financially this is actually putting them in. And again, most people will not tell you this. If you go to a business incubator, they will tell you to get VC, and they will celebrate when companies get really large VC rounds. But you will barely hear a single description of these kinds of concepts like liquidation preference. But you need to be aware of it, because this can be a really big problem for founders. So, but then the question is, why do founders accept this, right? I mean, if, these term sheets are really so bad, and if they are taking so much money away from the original founders, why did they agree to this in the first place? And it's quite simple. It's because, let's say a SoftBank comes up to you and says, I'm going to give you 100 million for your company. This is the term sheet. If you have any questions about the term sheet or want that changed, no problem. I'm just going to walk away and go to your competitor and make them the same offer. This is why ultimately the founders accept these kinds of term sheets. It's because the VCs are playing hardball. And, well, quite simply, if they want the capital, they don't have a choice. So, all right. So we're going to change angles now. I think we've discussed VC and the Silicon Valley model and the startup ecosystem. Let's now look a bit more towards things like business education. Okay? So we're going to start by just considering the purpose of education in the first place, right? So democracy needs a well-functioning educational system. But of course, through the years, the educational system has changed. It has very much become a business, and it has sort of gone, back in the early days, it was about giving people a broad education so they could become more well-rounded, happy humans, right? But at a certain point, the focus of that education shifted away from creating well-rounded humans and towards job readiness, right? Because, you know, we're all supposed to graduate and be able to get that job. And what winds up happening is we are actually, the companies are kind of outsourcing some of that task of job training basically onto the public school system. So, but of course in school, I mean, the real point, especially if you're talking about primary school or secondary school, the real point is to learn how to interact with other humans, to learn our history, to learn how to collaborate, you know, to learn how to be better humans. But of course, you know, over the years, things have shifted. Now, if we go to business schools, things also are sometimes stacked in a way that we sort of need to ask, you know, who exactly is being served here, and is what's being taught really best for the students, or is it just that we're reinforcing the status quo? So there was a walkout from Harvard University and their EC10 class of Professor Gregory Mankiw. So Occupy, they sat down in the front row, and they stood up, and then they said, "We do not want the ideology that you are teaching in this class." And then they walked out. They did this, of course, because with the economics curriculum, what is being taught, you know, neoclassical economics, is not satisfying today's challenges, right? You know, and the students, after they walked out, they created different student societies, one of which is called Rethinking Economics, and another, there's also Post-Crash Economics Society, there's quite a number of other ones. And the real question is, why have we not been having similar walkouts from our MBA and entrepreneurship programs? Because quite frankly, you know, if we do want to create a better world, what we are learning is not just reinforcing the status quo, but it is making things much worse, right? Because we all want things to change, but the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome, right? You know, and even just, you know, being taught that success is Mark Zuckerberg and the Google guys and Jeff Bezos, right? I mean, we maybe need to reevaluate the whole entrepreneurship and MBA curriculum as well. So Martin Parker from the University of Bristol actually wrote a very interesting article that he called Bulldoze the Business School, which was quite a pointed critique about some of the different subjects in the business school and how there's a kind of a hidden curriculum that's being taught in the business school. And he later expanded that essay out into a full book that's called Shut Down the Business School. So when he talks about the hidden curriculum, I mean, part of it is just framing. So things like how capitalism is assumed to be superior to all other models and how it's won. And also, students most of the time, they are learning how things are, but they're not necessarily learning how to change things or how things could be, right? So, you know, and he goes through many of the different topics in the book, things like accounting, finance, management, information systems, marketing, et cetera, et cetera. And for each of these subjects, he covers exactly what is the hidden, you know, sort of, what is the implicit assumptions that were also being delivered with each of these classes. So just to give you a few examples, if you're talking about things like accounting, A lot of what we're learning is how to not pay taxes, right? I mean, as if there's something wrong with paying taxes. In our finance classes, we are learning that it is both laudable and desirable to basically have usurious behavior and to earn money off of more money and to maximize those returns. This is also implicit. Other things like marketing. I mean, for example, teaching us how to be able to sort of push products on people that may not even be good for them or necessary for them. This is the point. And even with things like learning about social enterprise and corporate social responsibility, I mean, we need to also ask how much of this is even reputation laundering for the business school itself, as opposed to really being well meant. I mean, most of the time when you think about things like ethics, you're thinking, I mean, first you're going to have a discussion of the trolley problem. I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with the trolley problem, it's usually like, okay, so you have a computerized trolley and you can either hit run over like 2 old people and 1 young person, take your pick, right? And we sort of assume that that is ethics. But truthfully speaking, though, of course, that ain't nothing compared to all these extractive business models, and what we're actually doing to society as a large. But that is persistently the topic that is never covered, right? And that's completely ignored. So, but if you also consider things like startup incubators, you can go back to basics. So the very first incubator in the world was called the Batavia Industrial Center in Batavia, New York. And there was a guy who started it, and his name was Joe Mancuso. And his family was rich, right? So in Batavia, New York, there was some industry that was in the town, and at a certain point, the industry left town, right? And then the people, they all lost their jobs, and then they were poor. And these Mancusos, they owned the movie theater and the local restaurants, and they didn't want people to be poor. They wanted them to continue patronizing their restaurants and their movie theaters. So what they did is they bought a really large empty building, and then they got some shared facilities, things like, pens and staplers and secretarial services and cleaning and, just some desk space that people could use. And one of the original tenants of the Batavia Industrial Center was called the Mount Hope Chicken Hatchery. So basically they had these little chickens that were running around the building. And at one point, Joe was with a reporter, and then they were visiting the hatchery, and he said, well, here they're incubating chickens, but I guess, here we're incubating businesses. So that is actually where the term, business incubator originally came from, And the whole point of this incubator was not to create unicorns. Rather, it was to revitalize a local economy. Of course, revitalizing a local economy, this is particularly relevant because if we think about, for example, the pandemic that we recently had, for the last couple of years, of course, a lot of our restaurants and stores suffered, a lot of things closed, and we kept talking about this quote-unquote new normal, that we were going to be moving to after this whole thing was over, and yet it somehow seems we're going back to the same status quo where we started, and if you consider then things like in the Netherlands, the Nationale Groeifonds, the National Growth Fund, that then also is putting huge investments into, again, cultivating eventually unicorns in different areas. You have to start asking the question also, is the government putting that money for rebuilding into the right place? But you have this echo chamber in government where they keep saying, we need more unicorns in the Netherlands, right? And we need more foreign investment and all of these things, and really just trying to break into this, into this bubble is really quite hard. So, anyway, But back to the Batavia Industrial Center, Joe Mancuso, his definition of success for this incubator was when the startup founders, when their businesses were successful enough that they could actually move out of the BIC and open up their own store on Main Street. You know, and he literally, for each of these founders, he took a photo and hung a picture of them up on the wall, you know, as being each of his success stories for when they finally opened their own shop in Main Street. But startup incubators didn't stay this way. At a certain point, we got a different kind of incubator, sort of a more high-tech incubator. And one of the very early examples of a high-tech incubator was created by an entrepreneur whose name was Nolan Bushnell. So Nolan Bushnell was the founder of Atari. I mean, I'm not sure how many of you are old enough to have played Atari. But, you know, and also in the United States, the Chuck E. Cheese branch of pizza restaurants. They also have animatronics. It's kind of fun. But anyway, but the point is that after Bushnell sold Atari, of course, he was sitting on a lot of money, and he wanted to make a return on his investment. So what he did is he created something called Catalyst Ventures, which took each of his business ideas, and he basically treated them like lottery tickets. And for Bushnell, sort of his definition of success, you know, it wasn't even that the companies were profitable, but it was just that they managed to have an exit, and he managed to get a return on his investment. So in the end, Catalyst was a success for Bushnell. His startups, so 7 out of 14 made money, 2 of them broke even, and 6 of them had losses. But in the end, he did pretty well with this model. So this inspired many other kinds of tech incubators. And another very prominent example are things like Y Combinator, Techstars, right? So I'm going to take you to a quote from Paul Graham, who is one of the founders of Y Combinator. He wrote a very controversial blog post, and in that blog post, he wrote, "I am a manufacturer of economic inequality." So you can't say that these guys don't know what they're doing. So what's actually happening here? If you go to most startup incubators, the problem here is that they face a financial conflict of interest with what they're teaching. So most startup incubators take equity in their own startups. You know, and because they take equity in their startups and their business model relies on it, then they, of course, are then encouraging those startups to grow exponentially and then have an exit in 3 to 5 years, because that is the business model of the incubator. Now, not all incubators run this way. Like, for example, let's say you want to start up at Amsterdam Center for Entrepreneurship, ACE, right? So at ACE, their business model is different. So they receive subsidies from the government. So if you, for example, want to do non-traditional, you know, startups, even or social enterprises, they're a bit more open-minded to this because they're grant-funded, right? I've done a lot of work with ACE. They're really quite friendly. Also, Radically Open Security, my company, was incubated at ACE, so I have nothing but really good things to say about them. But one time I went to a commercial incubator who will not be named. I don't need to name them, doesn't matter. They're all the same anyway. But the point is that, you know, I said to them, look, dear insert name of incubator here, I would love to give a lecture on new forms of social enterprise and also on bootstrapping to some of your startup founders. I would be happy to give this lecture completely free of charge. I won't charge you a cent for it. Let me know what you think. And I'm doing it at ACE, and you don't want to be left behind, right? And the incubator thought about it, And then they said, well, you know, our investors are investment banks like Merrill Lynch. So, you know, I don't think they're really going to like what you have to say. So I'm really sorry, but I'm afraid that we have to politely decline. This is a very clear illustration of that conflict of interest. You know, to the point that they literally will turn down the offer of a free lecture on new forms of social enterprise because it puts their own business model at risk. Think about this. And here's the other thing. Nobody talks about this. One more thing. With startup incubators, a lot of the time you notice in the events that they organize, in the media and newsletters that they send around, that there is a very large emphasis on things like VCs, scaling, and exits. If you consider your typical newsletter, I mean, what you're going to have is things like, you know, breakfast with investors, you know, and congratulations to such and such startup who just got their B round, and you know, and oh, and well, here's a class. We'll teach you how to make a pitch deck, right? It's always the same, you know, and again, it's always pushing that same model of entrepreneurship. But it doesn't have to be this way, right? I mean, if you, as a startup founder, show up to some of these commercial incubators and you just say, you know, I would really like help with bootstrapping my startup. I don't want a VC. I don't need that. It's all right. But can you just teach me how to run a solid business? They're going to look at you very confused. You know, because it's really not the way that businesses are run anymore. But that's kind of odd, don't you think? That there's so few places as aspiring startup founders that we can actually go to learn how to bootstrap a business, you know, to actually learn how to start a business from customer revenue rather than huge capital injections from outside. And this is a really great omission, you know. There's also a similar financial conflict of interest that we have with business schools. But it depends on which business school it is and how large they are. So with really large business schools, things like, you know, the Harvards and the Stanfords and the MITs, they're receiving really huge amounts of money called endowments, right? And for them, I think it's a lot harder, for example, to have a class like this one, because a lot of the people who give those endowments, who give those huge amounts of money, don't necessarily want the status quo to change, right? But then you have, for example, a University of Amsterdam. What's the business model of the University of Amsterdam? Well, mostly subsidy from the government, right? Grants from the government. And a professor, like, for example, Stefan Mol, right, you know, who's the official host for this course, he's just going to think, oh, but this is cool research, right? Why wouldn't we want this here? This is forward thinking, right? You know, and who knows, maybe we could even get some grants to do some research on it. That's it. But both ways, you know, it's kind of like follow the money, because that really clearly shows where the incentives lie. All right. So I'm going to continue on with talking about what we would typically think is the solution for all of this. And of course, if you then ask, well, okay, these are all the problems, I get it, these are all the problems, but how do we fix it, right? You know, and the first thing we're going to think about is, and you know, look, in most of our faculties, we do have a social enterprise, you know, program now, you know, and social enterprise classes. But are those social enterprise classes really, you know, all that different? You know, we do have things like impact VCs, you know, selling your B corporation to Unilever. I mean, we kind of have this gut feeling that social enterprise might not be getting us currently as far as it needs to go. But first, let's break it down a little bit. What is actually social enterprise? What is its promise? And where are the points that perhaps it could be improved? So let's start with the broad concepts of social enterprise. And it really starts with the understanding that systemic problems require systemic solutions, right? It's really easy for pundits and politicians to blame individual people for their personal behavior. Like, well, of course it's your fault that the earth is so polluted because you're using all these products with plastic, and you're eating meat, and you're driving a big car, and this is your fault. You know, if you really cared, you individually would make different choices, right? But here's the thing. I mean, putting the blame on individual people is incredibly counterproductive, because it is almost impossible to even participate in modern society without using plastic, without, being able to have some form of transportation to get around, without, just consuming, right? That's what we do. We consume. So, if you have companies that can offer people different ways of doing it and offer people better, more sustainable choices, then at that point you are giving the consumers a choice, that they can basically just use their euros to pay for, and then you get different outcomes. But the problem is, most of the time those people don't have the choice to begin with. Right? So that's why entrepreneurship is actually so important. What we're doing is we're actually creating choices for the consumers, because if we don't go out on a limb and start those companies in the first place, then that choice will not be available. It's like, there were no electric cars until, people started companies to create them. These kinds of things. Not that I'm saying the electric car is perfect, but nonetheless. One example, vegetarian meat products. Right? A lot of us might be bothered by animal suffering in the meat industry. And, there's a lot of really great companies that have offered alternatives. Of course, here in the Netherlands, we had the Vegetarische Slager, the vegetarian butcher, who makes, quite frankly, really great products. Right? And then you have others like Beyond Meat. Some of these alternative meat products now, I would say, are almost better than the real thing. And what it enables us to do is it enables the consumer to save a whole lot of, animal suffering, but also resource consumption and for the planet with grazing all these animals and whatnot. But the point is, someone had to start that company. But once it's there, it gives us that choice and that alternative that we then can use for ourselves. And it's not just vegetarian meat. It's also the same thing with alternatives to single-use plastics. There's a whole variety of different kinds of fair trade kinds of companies that we could start. And I would say that this is kind of the basis for social enterprise. So if we want to tackle, the problems that are in this world, as Extinction Rebellion says it, system change, not climate change. Because if you can manage to change the system, then you will get those byproducts, like climate degradation and economic inequality. You will, if you address the root causes for these things and really, create alternatives, then it's far more effective sometimes than just going after the symptoms. Yes?
I think a lot of the meat substitute producers that you mentioned are VC financed. A vegetarian butcher was sold to Unilever, and I know that the founders are using that money to investigate how to produce vegan cheese now. Do you think that was a bad move, and do you think those producers would be able to scale up as fast as they did without VC?
Yeah. So, good question. So, will impact VC allow us to be able to scale our impact? And this is always a really common question, right? Here's my opinion on it. The founders of Vegetarian Butcher no longer have control over their company. Basically, they're now a part of Unilever. Unilever is at the whims of the stock market. And Unilever also in the past has been multiple times attacked by these so-called activist, hedge fund managers. For example, the CEO, Paul Polman, I mean, there's an entire book about it, but he was trying very hard with Unilever to be social and to make things better. But then what happens is these activist VCs come in, they buy some minority shareholding, and then what they do is they put a lot of pressure on the company to increase profits, and then they do a lot of stock buybacks after trimming value from the company, and then they run. The problem is that despite the good intentions of the CEO, if these aggressive shareholders come in, it's not always possible to fight them off. I believe that more recently, I want to say, I think it was Trion Asset Management most recently that was going after Unilever this time. Every time it's a different one. But basically, the problem is a lot of these hedge fund managers, they see CSR and anything sustainable as like fat that they can trim from the company. So, so they basically squeeze these companies for its value. So as long as we can maintain the integrity of Unilever, and as long as the CEO of Unilever still thinks that vegetarische slager is in their mission, it could help them scale. But the problem is, the moment that sufficient shareholders actually say, well, we actually just want to liquidate this whole part of the company, I mean, they can't stop it, right? Now, yes, getting purchased by Unilever allowed them to scale the business quickly, but could they have grown the business without, getting purchased by Unilever? Maybe they could have just partnered with Unilever, to use their distribution network, and just come up with some kind of a sales construction that was win-win. That's the thing. You don't necessarily have to sell your company to partner with a larger company to make use of their distribution network. So, there's multiple ways to do it. But oftentimes, scaling your impact, this is sort of the excuse that I think a lot of founders of social enterprises have for cashing out, right? I mean, it depends on how you set things up. I mean, of course, you also have that proverbial case of Ben & Jerry's selling themselves to Unilever. And, I mean, they set things up where they tried to have some checks and balances to make sure that Unilever wouldn't completely, disrupt the internal operations of Ben & Jerry's. But it's been hard. And I remember one time, I think Ben & Jerry had a campaign. I don't remember exactly which way it was, but there was some kind of pressure to boycott Israel. And I think they didn't want to. And I think they wound up having a conflict between Ben & Jerry and the Unilever shareholders, and that turned into a whole thing. So ultimately, I mean, you are giving up control over your social enterprise when you're doing this. So, well, why don't we actually break right now? It's 11:57. Let's get started again in 10 minutes from now at 12:07, okay? All right, let's talk about social enterprise. The economist Kate Raworth, she says that there's 3 ways that companies can think about impact. One of which is doing less bad, one of which is doing no harm, and the other of which is doing good, right? I mean, one of which is sort of, I guess, CSR. But the other, of course, the doing good, that's the pure transformative social enterprise that she's encouraging us to do. Another thing that she also talks about a lot is that we have to create businesses that are regenerative. So it's not just enough that we're not destroying things, or that we're destroying things a little bit slower, right? But we actively need to play a role in making things better, right? Of course, there are entrepreneurial initiatives. I wouldn't necessarily call this a business, although it's run as a business, I think. But things like for example, the ocean cleanup, right? I mean, a really good example of a project that is very clearly regenerative. But, and social enterprise as a whole is a combination of a number of different topics that all contribute towards building a regenerative business. None of these individual building blocks on their own will kind of necessarily get you all the way, but the really nice thing about social enterprise is there's a lot of different angles that you can take, and there's a lot of different characteristics that you can have of your companies, and you can sort of pick and choose from these things where you need them. I would highly recommend having a look at Michel Bauwens' Peer-to-Peer Foundation wiki. It's a huge, extensive group of, almost anything related to social enterprise, new economy. I mean, he really has descriptions of all the different kinds of social businesses that you possibly could have. Everything from platform co-ops to local currencies to transition towns to, really extensive list in which you can really sample the sheer diversity of the possible kinds of social enterprises you could have. In this course, I'm going to highlight some of the building blocks of social enterprise. I don't think this is necessarily exhaustive, but I do think that a lot of social enterprises tend to have these characteristics. Of course, it all starts with a social mission. You have low profit and non-profit entity forms that are available. Self-ownership and steward ownership. Stakeholder governance and cooperatives, sustainability, regeneration, and circularity, transparency, participation, and inclusivity, locality and decentralization, and also charity and cross-subsidizing. Okay. I'm going to go into a bit of detail about each of these building blocks. So we're going to start with the social mission. So it starts with something that people tend to call the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit, right? And furthermore, what they're trying to do is they're trying to enforce what's called stakeholder primacy and overcome shareholder primacy by embedding the mission and this triple bottom line. In other words, trying to find a balance between these three things. They're actually putting this into their statutes. One of the innovators in this space has been the B Corp movement. Again, I'm not saying that B Corp as it is entirely 100% perfect, but they are an innovator in this particular area in writing this triple bottom line into their statutes. So you've also got low profit entity forms, which are government sanctioned legal entities that you can actually use to register your company. So, confusingly enough, you also have the B Corporation, not to be confused with the B Corp. Of course, B Corp is basically just a trademark of B Lab, which is just a certification in which they're sort of authorizing your triple bottom line and then giving you a certification. Whereas a B Corporation in the United States is an actual legal entity. You also have L3Cs, public benefit corporations. You have community interest companies in the UK, GmbHs in the Netherlands, and of course here, in Germany. And here in the Netherlands, we have the up-and-coming BVM. I'm sure some of you had heard some noises about the BVM. Not saying these entity forms are perfect in and of themselves. Of course, with the triple bottom line, you still do have profits embedded in there, but what you're doing is you are featuring some amount of asset locks which limit financial extraction from companies, and this can be a useful tool. You also have non-profit entity forms. So you can start a business as a non-profit, as something like a pure foundation. Hospitals, universities, surprisingly, are implemented sometimes as foundations, showing that you can actually run quite a considerable business as a foundation. Wikipedia also, Jamie Wales started Wikipedia as a foundation. But the problem with trying to use a foundation to start your company is that it might arise the ire of the tax authorities. I think I mentioned this in the last class, because if you're basically acting too much like a business, they might actually limit the amount of revenue that you can have. And that's why there's also hybrid forms. So in other words, foundation-owned businesses, where businesses, 100% of the shares are owned by a foundation. And there is a surprising history of companies that have operated this way. Zeiss, Bertelsmann, Heineken, IKEA, Bosch, Rolex, the Tata Group, Carlsberg, and of course most recently Patagonia. Another thing also is that particularly in Denmark, but also in general in Scandinavia, foundation-owned companies are huge. Again, I'm not telling you this is perfect. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call IKEA a social enterprise, just because it happens to be owned by a foundation. But remember, these are building blocks. These are things that you can sort of mix and match and combine. So it won't get you all the way, but it still can get you part of the way. So it's interesting to know about these constructions. Steward ownership. So the steward ownership movement, well, the term was actually coined by Armin Stuernagel in 2017 in his TED Talk. And he also created the Purpose Foundation that is also based in Germany. And the whole idea behind steward ownership is they are separating profit rights from voting rights. They also tend to embrace such things as foundation ownership. And they have another really interesting tool that's part of steward ownership, and it's called the golden share. So what a golden share is it's kind of like a poison pill construction in which you give a single veto share, so basically a single share that can block eventual sale of the company. So basically with this golden share, the whole purpose is creating a company that cannot be sold. Of course, I mean, most VCs would be like, yeah, why would you want to do that? But the point is that with the steward ownership movement, you have more of these kinds of companies that really are trying to set up companies for the long term. There are hundreds of steward-owned companies. So this, I mean, of course, there were a lot of companies that operated with these traits, such as self-ownership, before steward ownership came along as a movement. But more recently, companies like Ecosia, Einhorn, Buffer, Ableton. Also here in the Netherlands, you also have We Are Stewards, which is a great organization run by Gijsbert Koren. And also there's some Dutch steward-owned companies, things like Boord and Stift. It's a whole movement, right? So I wouldn't yet call it mainstream, but of course with Patagonia and with Yvon Chouinard's fairly recent move to creating his climate foundation, of course, this is also an example of steward ownership. And I would say it's sort of the first time almost that steward ownership really has gotten into the mainstream. Even to the point of getting a right-wing backlash after Yvon Chouinard gave the company away to a foundation, which I also thought was very interesting because it was the first time that steward ownership was actually in the mainstream enough to create a backlash, which I think is progress. So, but hopefully we'll be getting more of these. Cooperatives. So I'm sure you all have heard of co-ops. Now, the whole idea with co-ops is it's stakeholder governance. So, and typically with co-ops, they tend to be either employee-owned or customer-owned. The whole idea behind a co-op is that the stakeholders themselves are the ones that own the tools of value creation. You also have a variation on this, what they call platform co-ops, in which they're essentially trying to build platform organizations, again, similar to the Ubers and the Airbnbs of the world. but rather it's owned by the workers. So you have many very interesting examples of, like for example, the drivers cooperative in New York City that is competing against Uber, that really is trying to have something owned and run by the drivers. So they're really trying to take that value and distribute that amongst the actual stakeholders and employees in that company. Another organization that has promoted co-ops a whole lot lately is Zebras Unite. I mean, Zebras Unite anyway is a very interesting organization, and they've been questioning things like VC for considerably longer. But they've taken a somewhat recent shift in the last few years also in the direction of cooperatives. And they created a concept called exit to community. And this is actually quite interesting. What they do is they basically try and find some kind of a way to buy out the owner of a particular company so that the employees can then, basically it's taking a privately held company and turning it into a co-op. Okay? And I've seen also exits to steward ownership happen as well. I mean, basically you can do something a little bit similar to a leveraged buyout. So basically what it is you say, we're going to pay the founder a certain amount of money basically to sell the company to, for example, a foundation, and then the company itself goes into a debt that it pays off after a certain period of time. I've seen companies also operate in this way. It's interesting. I mean, again, you're still facilitating exits here, but it's still interesting building blocks, I think, that people are putting out. And to think that one can transform companies this way. So, of course, sustainability is a really obvious one for social enterprise. Things like climate change and biodiversity loss, carbon, offsetting and reclamation, resource usage, things where reduce, reuse, recycle. But that's not the only kind of sustainability that we might have. Another concept that I really quite like is thinking about business as a vehicle for degrowth. And I have to explain this for a minute. So most of the time when people think about degrowth, they tend to think about, people get scared, right? The moment they hear the term degrowth, then they think, oh, but this means we have to sacrifice everything and live in caves and, I don't think that that's what degrowth actually means. Charles Eisenstein, he wrote a book called Sacred Economics. In that book, he described, first of all, he kind of described innovation as being the conversion of non-monetized human relationships and the commons into money. So let's say that you go to a startup incubator and you want to start some startup of some kind, and they're probably what they're going to tell you is, think about, something that people are currently not paying for, like some kind of human relationship and, or something in the commons, and put yourself in the middle of that, and find some business model, find some way to monetize this, and then you have your company, right? I mean, that's kind of our definition of innovation. But what Charles Eisenstein in his book is actually suggesting is that degrowth, what you actually could be doing instead is taking the monetized economy and then cannibalizing that and then using that to recreate the commons and to recreate non-monetized human relationships. And that's what I would call, business as a vehicle for degrowth. So this is also kind of another way, I think, that we can use companies to be sustainable. And also you have circularity, which of course is taking a cradle-to-cradle approach with resource usage. In other words, what comes out of the system should be input for the system again, going around that circle the next time, which is as opposed to a cradle to grave approach that most products take. You have inclusivity, right? Things like radical transparency in your company. It could be that you're trying to make sort of communication channels open door policies in your company, having, business critical information be available for everyone in the company. I mean, for example, companies like Google, for a very long time had a culture of openness and transparency, which, at a certain point that changed. But it did start out that way, and it was one of the things that really helped the company to be able to function very well. It also helps a company to be better because, of course, the light sort of prevents weird things from happening oftentimes. So really, that transparency can also try and make sure that things kind of go the way they should be going. You also have participation, which is really just trying to make sure that stakeholders, but also a larger and more diverse group of people can give a say in your company. And then, of course, you have things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are also quite a popular topic these days, but also really just talking about how can we also hire more diverse employees at our company, how can we make sure that everyone feels safe and heard, these kinds of things. So locality. So you can have a business that is focused on stimulating your local ecosystem. So in other words, you're not building the unicorn, but rather you're just building something funky and local, to make your neighborhood better, And let's face it, like being here in Amsterdam, we've got a lot of those kinds of businesses, right? Not as many as we used to, but a lot of what makes Amsterdam also really great is just a lot of the really local initiatives, local efforts, local companies, that we have that are just really funky and just, oriented to the local place that we have. You can have things like community shops and pubs, community banks, those are frequent constructions. And you also can embrace things like decentralization. I think last time I mentioned Buurtzorg, which was that home healthcare provider, which is horizontally organized. And they basically are creating like little local pods of nurses, of healthcare providers, and basically trying to keep the organization really flat because a group of nurses in a particular location are going to be able to decide best for themselves exactly how to take care of the patients in the area. So it's a larger organization, but they're decentralizing the whole thing and creating these little autonomous pods that are local that then can operate autonomously. So that's another way that you can do it. It's worth noting that this kind of locality and decentralization is a very different issue than things like blockchains, cryptocurrency, decentralized finance, NFTs, distributed autonomous organizations. That's also very much a hype. Certainly has been a hype in the last number of years. I like the spirit of these movements, but I'm a professional cybersecurity expert. I do understand how the crypto works, and I do not believe actually that the technology lives up to the claims that it's making. So I really like the spirit behind a lot of these things, but with blockchain, but I don't think that the implementation, I could give a whole another class on this, and I'm not going to. Actually, I recorded a YouTube video, which was basically a 20-minute rant on the topic, which was at Tech Open Air in Berlin. If you want to know more about my opinion on blockchain and cryptocurrency, I would invite you to have a look at that YouTube video. But nonetheless, of course, my beef also with cryptocurrency is, of course, that, it started out trying to be all anarchistic and, power to the people. And in the end, it just wound up being the same old kind of financial system that it was trying to overthrow. And of course, we've also seen that in more recent days with Sam Bankman-Fried. And, things are, the cryptocurrency ecosystem is extremely centralized now. So it also hasn't delivered on that promise of decentralization that it intended to. So keep this in mind. Another one of these characteristics of social enterprise is charity. So frequently, a company will give some percentage of its profits to charity. It could be 5%, it could be 10%, it could be 90%, it could be 100%, right? Depending on the kind of company. Now, the pioneer of really giving all of your profits to charity was Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Prize winning economist from Bangladesh, who invented microfinance in the Grameen Bank, and he also wrote a book called Building Social Business. So he defines social business as follows: no dividend companies solving human problems. Of course, the whole solving human problems part got very popular, right? A lot of people jumped on this. But the whole no dividend part, we didn't hear that one, right? And that kind of got swept under the rug. This also led, much to the chagrin of Muhammad Yunus, by the way, to things like commercial extractive microfinance, which wasn't what he was intending, but all the same. But his idea was that you would have two kinds of social business, and he called it type 1 and type 2 social business. So type 1 social business is when you are running a company purely as an impact vehicle, and then you ensure that all profits are reinvested into that vehicle for activism. A type 2 social business is basically the same thing, except for the fact that you are dividending some of those profits out to charity. So I thought I was being really special and unique with radically open security when I decided, to make us foundation owned and, to give 90% of our profits to charity. But actually, I wasn't all that unique at all, because Muhammad Yunus had basically been doing this for considerably longer. He also created a number of companies that work with his own principles, not just Grameen Bank, which is one of them, of course, but also, for example, Grameen Danone, which was a partnership that he did with Danone, the French yogurt company. And what they did is they sold this nutrient-rich yogurt to, for example, in places like India. And in the rich areas, he was able to sell it for a little bit more money, be able to collect some profits there, and then use those profits to be able to cross-subsidize the yogurt to be able to sell it cheaper in rural areas where people didn't have so much money. Particularly in India, the whole cross-subsidization concept also has been really popular. And you've got some examples of things like the Arvind Eye Care Center, the Aga Khan University Hospital, that also operate on the same principles. They're charging higher rates to the rich Westerners or even rich Indians, the people who are rich and who can afford more expensive treatment, and then they use the profits from that to cross-subsidize treatment for the poor. Excellent, right? All right, so social enterprise has a lot of promise, right? There's a lot of different building blocks that we have, a lot of different tools that we have, and yet it doesn't always go according to plan, right? At a certain point, a social enterprise might be using some of these tools, but at the end of the day, they're also still making extractive profits, so we really don't understand how much of this is marketing and how much of this is genuine. And this has really caused a lot of people to become skeptical about the concept of social enterprise as a whole. Greenwashing, of course, is a thing. Greenwashing, social washing, impact washing, steward washing, open source washing, you name it. I mean, there's different ways that you can wash with anything. And then you also, things like mission statements, right? I mean, you get these corporate mission statements that are completely incongruous with the way the companies are actually behaving. You also have cases where somebody starts as a social enterprise, and then at a certain point, it kind of gets mission drift. When mission drift basically means that at a certain point, growth and extraction somehow gets embedded in all this and becomes more important than what it originally started out for. I think a kind of interesting recent case study is looking at OpenAI. I mean, I'm sure you all have probably played with OpenAI's tools, things like DALL-E and ChatGPT. Let's face it, it's cool. It's super cool, you know, and it probably will be disruptive, and it's, you know, it's really neat stuff to play with. It's also a bit scary, but it's also super neat. But at the same time, you know, OpenAI actually started as a foundation, right? I mean, it had a number of founders among Elon Musk, you know, but at a certain point, to sort of scale and accelerate you know, the development of the software, they got very huge capital injections, mostly from Microsoft, but also from other VCs. And I mean, at this point, OpenAI, for the most part, has kind of morphed into a commercial company. And it sort of shows how something can start out as a foundation, but at a certain point, just things change. You know, they have a change of heart, you know, just the conditions change later, and then the whole thing shifts. It's the same thing also, for example, with some of the low-profit entity forms, like, for example, the BVM. Again, not a lot of people talk about this, but one of the problems with the BVM is, let's say I want to start a company as a BVM, and I get all the benefits of being social. So in other words, I get all the tax breaks and all the social procurement benefits from being a BVM. And then I can then decide, just on a whim, to change it from a BVM back to a standard BV. There is absolutely nothing in that construction that is stopping me from doing that. This is a problem, by the way. And also, I have to say that they had a feedback round, basically request for comments, in the process of developing that BVM, and they had quite a bit of feedback from a lot of different parties. I don't know what happened with that feedback. See, here's the problem with all of this. Social enterprise itself also has a lot of money, you know, and there also are a lot of powerful interests behind this. And the problem here also is that social enterprise, much of the time, is still extractive. And this sort of gets at the heart of it, the problem. The greenwashing is the financial extraction. Another thing also is if you consider case studies like Elon Musk, right? You know, I mean, I used to think that he was a hero, you know, when he first started out with Tesla. But of course, nowadays, well, I mean, you know, he is the world's richest human being, you know. And the problem here is that, of course, I mean, Tesla also grew from receiving a lot of environmental subsidies. I mean, a lot of people even are still getting things like tax credits for electric cars in some countries. And the point was that he benefited from a lot of this. And yet, how is it that a social enterprise that is dedicated to making electric cars, that so much financial value can be extracted from this that it leads someone to become the richest man in the world? You know? Similarly, I mean, you know, and even if there's a market downturn, like you can see Tesla stock right now is really tanking. You know, is Elon Musk taking his untold billions that he earned, you know, from Tesla, you know, is he putting that money back into Tesla, you know, to potentially save the company? No. Instead, I mean, he's basically, you know, playing games with Twitter with the money, you know, trying to make the platform more conservative and right-wing leaning. All right, fine, he can do that. But the point is, though, that, I mean, we also, again, don't ask the questions often enough. I mean, is this not misappropriation of climate subsidies? You know, everyone kind of thinks that he's a genius, but, you know, are there ways that we can actually create social enterprises in a way that we can't extract so much value out of that social enterprise? This is the question in this class really that we need to address. So, and that comes down to the word profits, right? We all think that we know what the word profit means, right? Don't we? But it actually turns out that the word profit has a double meaning. So the first meaning of the word profit is what I would call reinvestable margin. So in other words, let's say that I have a product that I'm going to sell to you. Like let's say, for example, that I have a banana, right? And I am going to buy that banana for 50 cents and then sell that banana to you for 125. And then basically that money that I earned off of that banana, the 75-cent margin, that is what I reinvest to, well, I mean, first I have to, of course, have to pay off my banana supplier. Then I, have to pay for our staff and pay for our office and, basically put that money back in to be able to grow the business itself. So that's the first meaning of the word profit, reinvestable margin. Now, the second meaning of the word profit is financial extraction. And that is my private jet and my Lamborghini, and all of those things that some people want if they're founding a company. But look, obviously, this creates a lot of confusion, right? Because when we think about the word profit, see, it has those two meanings embedded in that same word, which means that we have trouble in our heads separating out those two concepts. So if somebody says what sounds like a common sense, no-brainer kind of statement, like, well, of course my company needs to be profitable to survive. If you're talking about reinvestable margin, I totally agree. But if you're talking about financial extraction, not only do I disagree, but it is actively harmful and it is even a competitive disadvantage on the market. Because, of course, cash that you pull out of a company is less cash that you have for paying your staff, for, better products and services, lowering prices, better quality insurance, that kind of stuff. So extraction is never good for a company. But the other problem then is that this double meaning in the word profit also makes things equally confusing for not-for-profits. Because a not-for-profit then says, okay, I get it. I'm not supposed to have financial extraction. Right, that's clear. That's obvious. But then the nonprofit or NGO then mistakenly assumes that they're not allowed to have reinvestable margin. We discussed this last time with the subsidy trap, right? And this, of course, is putting these NGOs into a position in which they're vulnerable and dependent on external subsidy. So now the profit's double meaning rears its ugly head again in the triple bottom line. People, planet, profit. Yeah, there's that profit again, right? So if you break it out, what you really have is people, planet, reinvestable margin, financial extraction. And that financial extraction is the greenwashing. So if you want to eliminate the greenwashing from social enterprise, it is as simple as eliminating the financial extraction. The real triple bottom line that we want is people, planet, reinvestable margin. I see that it's now 12:44, so I think I'm going to wait with moving on with the next slide since the class is basically over. Thank you so much, and I wish you a good rest of your day.